You've read the title. Today I am back with another installment in my intimidation series. In the last episode, I tackled a small section in 3 of my most intimidating untouched coloring books. And coloring a few little elements in each of those books really did make such a difference. Since then, those books don't feel nearly as scary to me, and I've even gone back and finished one of the pages that I started in that video, so wins all around. So since that video was so helpful in me getting over a mental block that I had for some of my coloring books, I wanted to do the same thing again, but with a slightly different focus. Instead of looking at intimidating books on a whole, I'm going to be focusing on specific elements that make a page feel overwhelming or daunting for me to color. So I sat down and made a list of the ones that trip me up the most, and here's what I came up with. We've got hair, skin, fur, grass, wood, crystals, water, metal, and glass. Now, some of these elements I have colored before, but whether or not I've never tackled them or I have done so a handful of times, they still spark a little bit of fear in my colorist heart whenever they pop up on a coloring page. So the goal for today's video is to color 3 of these intimidating elements on my list here in my coloring books. And hopefully that will make these coloring pages feel a little bit less scary to me. And I also hope that I can share some helpful tips with you along the way, or at least tell you what not to do. To keep things fair and stop myself from choosing the least 3 intimidating elements on this list, I'm going to use a spinner wheel to randomly choose which 3 elements that I color today. So let's see what fate has in store for me. Looks like it's going to be fur. Look, I have colored fur, I would say a good handful of times in my coloring pages, but it's still something that I feel so uncomfortable with. But the random spinner wheel has spoken. Now, before I actually get into the coloring of each of the elements that I will be tackling in today's video, I wanted to quickly share some book and page recommendations for each of the elements. Now, I think this is going to be the perfect recommendation for anyone out there who's looking to get into fur coloring, and that is Boule de Pois by Diane Dufour. This title translates to fur balls in English, and so every page is full of furry, hairy animal creatures. A page in particular that I was considering to color in this video is this cat one here, if I can get it up. What I think is great about this page is that you don't have too many overlapping elements. What makes this page a little bit trickier though is the fact that you don't have any fur direction guidelines, if that makes sense. It's definitely a good practice in figuring out what direction your fur should go in. A second book I wanted to recommend is Maria Troll's Universe by Maria Troll, obviously. Honestly, any Maria Troll book is gonna have a lot of animals that you can practice your fur coloring in. And one page in particular in this book that I have been wanting to color but have been scared by the fur aspect of it is this adorable little dog page here. Now, the great thing about this page in comparison to the one that I showed you in Boule de Pois is that this one does have some fur direction guidelines, but it also has a lot of overlapping elements sitting on top of the fur, and that's something I'm still trying to figure out with my fur coloring. How do you keep the fur texture whilst also having depth, dimension, and dark shadows? Now, an author I would personally go to when starting out fur coloring, pretty much any of Lulu Mayo's books. And because her illustration style is more on the cartoony side, It definitely eases the pressure in trying to create as realistic of a fur texture as possible. And so I've actually decided to colour in A Million Magical Creatures by Lulu Mayo for the fur colouring portion of this video. And I've chosen this page here. I think this page strikes a really great balance between the issues that I had with the other two pages, and it does have some overlapping objects, but not too much. And it also gives me great indication of the direction of the fur, which a lot of Lulu Mayo's illustrations does include. So I can't put it off any longer. Let's just get into colouring this funky little anteater creature here. For my fur colouring in A Million Magical Creatures, I decided to test out the Crayola pencils I picked up for my recent video where I only coloured with Crayola products for 8 hours. And in that video, I wasn't sure whether I was going to keep the pencils because I did struggle with them quite a bit. But one of you commented that you really enjoy using Crayola pencils in Lulu Mayo's book, so I thought I'd give them another try, and I was pleasantly surprised. They worked so much better than I expected. In fact, I think they performed even better than my Artex set, which is usually my go-to for Lulu's books. So I ultimately have decided to keep them and continue testing them on different paper types across my collection to see which books they end up suiting best. Another reason I wanted to use the Crayolas for this fur colouring is that they have a really hardcore and keep a sharp point, which is supposedly key when it comes to colouring fur. I showed my previous approach to fur in my honeymoon colouring vlog, but this time I tried a different method, which is probably the more technically correct way to do it. As you'll see, instead of the usual circular pencil motion, I used a flicking motion to mimic the texture of fur. I started with the second darkest shade in my combo and gradually worked through to the lightest. The biggest tip I can give you here is to shade the fur just like you normally would any other subject. Just swap out your usual technique for that flicking motion instead. It seems so obvious to me now, but when you're feeling intimidated by a certain element, logic does seem to fly out the window. Now you'll notice that I somewhat burnished the character using my lightest shade, which helped fill in the white tooth of the paper and also soften the fur texture just a little bit. This is definitely something I wouldn't have been able to do with a soft core pencil like Prismacolors. They're just too creamy and would have blended away all the detail. But the Crayolas were perfect for this. No smudging, and I think they really do shine when it comes to fine detailed work like fur. Once I had all the base shading and texture in place, I went back in with my darkest shade to enhance the depth and dimension further. This was probably the one downside of using the Crayola pencils for this fur colouring. Since they're not super pigmented, I couldn't get the strong contrast I usually like in my pages. So next time I'll probably pair them with a darker pencil from my Brute Funa or Artex sets in order to give the final piece that dimension I always like to strive for. And of course, I had to go in with a bit of an unconventional fur colour because, this book is called A Million Magical Creatures. I suppose the anteater is playing a guitar and wearing a party hat, so the fantasy vibes are already high, but I wanted to lean into it even more by just adding a bit of pink to the fur combo. Anyway, I continued to do a little extra layering and refining at the end, mostly just following my intuition, and then voila, my furry anteater was complete. And I'm really happy with how he turned out. I'm feeling much less intimidated about colouring fur now, and could see myself moving on to those other pages I showed you earlier from Maria Troll's Universe and Boule de Poire, now that I have a stronger idea of how to create shadows and fur texture at the same time. It is time to find out what our next intimidating element to colour in this video is. It's gonna be water. Now, water's a funny one because obviously it can show up in a variety of different ways in your coloring pages and different perspectives as well. Like you could have an underwater scene, you could have a lake in a coloring page. There's so many different ways. But the way that intimidates me the most is creating that kind of ripply water effect. I feel like you can find an example of water in pretty much any coloring book. Ones I would recommend though, I'm gonna recommend another Maria Troll. This one has so many reflective water illustrations within it, and the water doesn't necessarily have a lot of details illustrated within it, so you do have some flexibility and freedom when it comes to how much detail you want to add. This page here is one that I think is especially good for rippling water practice. Something that stumps me with this page though is what is actually going to be reflected within the water. And I suppose it just depends on what you determine your light source is going to be and where it's coming from. Another option that I think is great is Forest and Nature by Raider Prince. This is a stunning book. It's single-sided, so you can use your alcohol markers. I think this page in particular would be really great for some water practice. However, in saying that, the water ripple details are a little bit faded in the illustration, so some thought would need to go into figuring out which of those details you take into consideration when you're shading the ripples and which ones you forego. The book I've decided to color in today though, to tackle my watercoloring fears, is World Legends by Eriy. I colored in this book in the last episode in this series, and whilst there are a lot of different examples of rippling water in this book, I actually want to continue working on the page that I worked on in the last episode, which is this mermaid page here. And the really interesting thing about this page is obviously that it is underwater, and you have this perspective of seeing the rippling water from down up. And yes, I did partly choose this page because I didn't want to create another whip for myself. Okay everyone, this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but water was the element I struggled with most in this video. I wasn't completely happy with how it turned out in the end, but like I said at the beginning, this video is just as much about showing you helpful tips as it is about showing you what not to do. So I'm about to walk you through what not to do when colouring water, or at least what didn't quite work for this specific page in Eriy's World Legends. I started with a base layer of watercolour pencil to build a smooth colour gradient, and subtly suggest that what I'm assuming is a light here was glowing against the blue. I didn't want a harsh or overly dramatic light effect, and the watercolour pencils really helped achieve that soft, subtle glow I was aiming for. Now, if you watched the last episode in this series, you'll remember I struggled using both my Artex and Prismacolors in this book. So this time around, I gave my Brute Funas a try, and they actually worked really well. Not perfect, but definitely a noticeable improvement. I think my Brute Funas have officially become my go-to pencil for Eriy's paper now. Anyway, my goal here was to create a rippling water effect and keep a smooth gradient from dark to light. Because when you're underwater and looking up, especially in a daytime scene, there's usually some sort of light source. So I placed mine in the upper right-hand corner and followed the shape of the ripple details already drawn into the illustration by Eriy. I created darker, curved ripples at the farthest points from the light source, and then lighter colours for the ripples closer to it. I also used those lighter shades to blend out the darker ripples to help everything transition more naturally. It was at this point I was feeling pretty good about the effect. It had a semi-realistic feel and actually looked like water, which is always a win. Now, I have been seeing a lot of colorists on Instagram recently use this technique where they add streaks of sunlight filtering through the water in an underwater scene, and I decided I wanted to give it a go for myself, so I grabbed my Derwent electric eraser and gently erased through some of the coloured pencil to create that sunbeam effect. You could use a ruler if you want it super crisp and clean, but I was going for a more organic look and just freehanded it. It might have been a bit risky on my part, but fortunately it all worked out. Now, although the brute funas held up fairly well on this paper, I still couldn't fully burnish the page to get that seamless, creamy blend that I love. So I brought in my trusty white Prismacolor pencil to save the day, and it really helped smooth everything out and gave the blues a much more polished finish. And then this is where things started to go downhill for me. I wasn't quite sure what to do with those lightning bolt shapes that Eriy had illustrated, and I wasn't a huge fan of the ripple line details either. It felt like they were distracting from the soft water effect I had created, so I decided to cover it all with white acrylic marker, but then that ended up looking way too stark on the page, so I tried colouring over that with my pencils to soften it, and it worked, but I felt like the water effect had lost some of its effectiveness as a result. Looking back, I probably should have just left the original black line work as is and maybe coloured those lightning bolt shapes in a light blue. I get that they're supposed to represent froth or bubbles in the water, but the shapes just felt too large and bold compared to the more subtle ripples I had created with the brute funas. But hey, what's done is done, and I know some of you will probably say I'm being way too hard on myself, as I usually am. Still, I do think that having a critical and analytical mindset actually helps me improve as a colorist. I'm pretty good at pinpointing what didn't work and figuring out what I could do differently next time. That said, I do need to work on finding a better balance where I'm not so hyper-focused on the flaws that I completely overlook the things that did go well. But anyway, mini tangent over. Here's the finished water, and while it didn't turn out quite as I envisioned, I hope it still shows that no matter how long you've been colouring for or how confident you are with your skills, mistakes are just part of the creative process. Something I try to remind both myself and anyone watching is if you had fun and learned something along the way, then that still counts as a successful colouring page. At least in my opinion.
Okie dokie, let's see what our last element to colour in this video is. Hopefully it's nothing too strenuous. Crystals! Okay, I'm happy with that. I actually wanted to tackle that element in this video, and the main reason crystals are intimidating to me because I've never coloured them before. So the book I'm going to recommend to you is Spooky by Sarah Shefchik. So the page in particular I wanted to recommend is this one here, and you've got these really strong crystal shapes right at the bottom. I think this is a great page to get you started with some crystal colouring. There's just 4 on the page, it's not too overwhelming. I've decided not to colour that page today though, because I want something a tinsy bit more challenging, because I'm crazy. The second book I'm going to recommend has lots of crystal pages in it, and the one in particular I wanted to show you is this page here with the turtle covered in crystals within this crystal cave. Holy moly! This one is very intimidating to me, especially the crystals that the squirrel is holding on top of the turtle's head. I just realized this is not a turtle, this is a tortoise. Disregard every time I said turtle before. That is definitely a page I am not wanting to tackle for my first crystal colouring experience, but definitely a great page for me to tackle once I've gotten more confident in my crystal colouring. The book I am going to colour in today though, and any Hanna Karlzon book is going to be a great option for crystal practice because she includes lots of crystals in her colouring books. I only have one of her books though. I've got Tales from the Witch's Cottage, and the page I've decided to colour in today's video is this one here with this slug with a house shell. There's lots of crystals on its back. And I feel like, yes, there are some smaller crystals there, but they're not to the point of that previous colouring book I showed you. And there's just enough crystals to do a lot of practice, but not too much where it's super duper overwhelming. So that's the last page I'll be colouring in this video. Let's get into it.
I think one of the trickiest parts about colouring crystals is figuring out where to place the shadows. So before jumping into this page, I did do a tinsy bit of research. I looked at some drawings of crystals, real life photos, and how other colourists approach them in their finished pages.
And honestly, from what I could tell, there's no right way to shade them. Some people add shadows toward the bottom, some follow a specific light source, and others just kind of place shadows here, there, and everywhere. So what I ended up doing was mapping out where I thought the darkest areas should be using my Artex watercolor pencils. I mostly focused on the lower portions of the crystals and then just added color wherever my intuition nudged me to do so. Personally, I think what makes a cluster of crystals look most effective is when the shading isn't uniform, when the shadows are a little scattered and you get those interesting geometric shapes forming within them. What you'll see me doing here is going back over those initial areas where I added a wash of colour using the darkest shades from my Prismacolor combos. And then, as I worked my way up towards the tops of each crystal, I added softer shading without going all the way to the edges of the line work. I wish I had a neat step-by-step method to share for colouring crystals, and maybe after I've coloured a few more, I'll have a clearer approach to share with you. But right now, I honestly think crystals are one of those elements that don't have a straightforward formula. That's probably why I saw so many different styles in the reference images I looked at. How you colour crystals really comes down to personal preference, and as long as you're keeping or enhancing that geometric shape, you can't go too wrong. Now, I was really tempted to go wild and do some multicoloured crystals for this page, but since it was my first proper attempt, I decided to play it safe and go with 3 separate colour combos. That said, now that I've gotten this first try out of the way, you better believe the next time crystals show up in one of my books, I'm going full rainbow. Because if you've been around for a while, you know I firmly believe in the more colour, the better. And while I'm on yet another classic Kira tangent, I'd really love to know, what makes a colouring page intimidating for you? Is it a particular element or subject like me? Is it the amount of detail, or maybe even a lack of detail? Let me know in the comments, we can chat about it, and who knows, maybe I'll even colour one of your intimidating elements in an upcoming video. Alright, once I had all my shadows and midtones down, it was time to bring out the trusty white Prismacolor once again and smush all the colours together to create some seamless blends. Now, the next 2 steps I'm about to show you are totally optional. I mean, everything is optional when it comes to colouring, but I decided to go in with my white Signo gel pen to just soften the appearance of the black line work and enhance that glassy, reflective, crystalline effect. And I also did 2 layers with the gel pen to get the level of opacity that I was happy with. After that, I added some additional reflective details and a few fine crack-like lines using my white Posca paint pen. I'm not sure I'd add those cracking details again though. They were kind of experimental. I'd seen something similar in a reference image and just wanted to try it out for myself. And whilst I do like how it turned out, I think whether I use that technique again will depend on the overall vibe of the page that I'm colouring. But anyway, there you have it, my completed crystals. I've really enjoyed colouring them, and I'm actually excited to try more crystal illustrations now in the future. As per usual, they ended up being nowhere near as intimidating as I'd built them up in my head. And there we have it. I have coloured 3 out of the 9 elements that make colouring pages intimidating for me. I'd really love to do a part 2 and maybe even a part 3 of this video where I tackle the rest of the intimidating elements on my list. So if that's something you'd like to see, definitely let me know in the comments below. But until next time, happy colouring friends. Have a good day, have a good life, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!